Hello and welcome to this panel on catalyzing demand. Firstly, just like to say a huge thank you to Climeworks for having us all here, and Tristan and the team for putting on this amazing event. I always think this is the sort of primary event of the year for this market, and so yeah, excited to be back, and yeah, excited to get stuck in today. So for those who don't know you, my name is Ted. Don't know me, my name is Ted. I'm Director of Carbon Removal at the ratings agency B0 Carbon. We're a ratings agency for the voluntary carbon market, and I look after the engineered solutions within that. So first things first on this discussion, I just wanted to get a quick gauge of the room. Can you please put your hand up if you are a corporate buyer of carbon removal? Right, developers, take notes. They're the ones to hunt down at the drinks later. But jokes aside, that was probably like 30 people. And it really made me think about this. I mean, I was in a dinner last week, which I did the maths, and I think it was about 92% of all historic purchase demand could fit around that one table. And I think that is sort of speaks to the challenge we're facing here from a voluntary point of view. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to get stuck in to this today. So a bit of housekeeping about how I'm going to run the session. We're going to dive straight into some questions in a minute, but what I want to do is try and keep a few minutes for audience participation at the end. But yeah, but quickly just to introduce the panel, we've got Bayo from Boston Consulting Group, Giana from Carbon Removal Alliance, Jack from Breakthrough Energy, and Erin from Carbon 180. So to kick us off, the first thing I really want to talk about is voluntary demand. So throughout the session, we're going to talk about both sort of future demand, looking at compliance, but also voluntary. Kicking off with voluntary. So Bayo, I've sort of alluded to that challenge we face at the moment, that it is mostly just tech and a bit of financial services in this market who are buying carbon removal credits. Where do you see that next tranche of demand coming from?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, right? And one that I'm sure many people are very keen to know about. This is not business development advice, but some useful framing for how to think about it. So if we look at the characteristics of the people who are buying today, they share both a very high ability to pay, which is really just perfectly correlated with their emissions intensity per profit, right? But they also have a supportive stakeholder ecosystem that gives them a willingness to deploy that ability to pay. So I guess I could reframe the question by saying, have we tapped out that early stage, early mover demand? And I think, well, the good thing is we don't think so, not at all. So if we think about the companies that are able to pay, companies that have targets to net zero, and we think about the amounts that they could need by 2030, and you compare that to what has been contracted so far, you probably are still talking maybe 10% of that demand through to 2030. So there is still some way to go on that demand. So you might ask the question then, why do we not have it? Well, if you look at the purchasing patterns of many companies, you see things like companies that have bought very small quantities of certain types, dipping their toes in the market, trying to understand how it works before they commit more, not knowing which technologies to back, etc. So there is work to do in bringing in that demand, in educating that demand, in helping them sort of like align the stakeholder landscape to unlock all of that. So there is some more to come from the same kind of buckets that we're looking at today. So current buyers, but other people within that sector who are not buying yet. So you could almost think about the sector that is buying professional services in tech. The market share for the companies that are buying today is still a minuscule portion of those entire industries. So again, there is more within that pocket. Then we can move a little bit to companies that will have pretty high residual emissions in the future, no matter what scenario you look at. And there I start to think about transport sector. Everyone thinks about aviation when we say this. The issue is that the margins are not quite the same. And so that ability to pay becomes a little bit more challenged. But here's where we have to get creative, because I think the premium end of those services could be places where you can embed CDR demand to create sort of carbon neutral products. We need to figure out the terminology, but create sort of lower emissions products that, you know, unlock that willingness to pay. And that takes me to the last bucket, which is really, if you think about any consumer-facing sector, CPG, etc., we again see the potential for a lot of demand there. It won't necessarily be the companies buying for their own net zero. It would likely be more on a product-linked basis.
Yeah, really interesting. I think that it's a good point to make, that even in those sectors, there's still untapped demand to get out of there. And I think, I know on a personal level, even just seeing who we've got here, there's definitely buyers that I hadn't seen before at other events, so I think it's already a promising move. Jack, just coming to you on this point, I mean, where do you see that next sort of tranche of buyers coming from? I mean, you mentioned some industries there, but I'd be interested to get any further insight.
Yeah, well, I think when you look in the buying space, right, there's a bunch of people who are volunteering to do it at the moment, which is great. And the other sort of method to bring buyers in is that they are voluntold to buy CDR. And that's a possibility that you know, governments around the world can put forth. That's, you know, sometimes not a popular topic, and especially in the United States, we're more of a carrots over sticks sort of approach to policy. But yeah, one way is obviously like they just have to do it, and you're told you have to. The other way is for buyers who want to do this, find a way to integrate it into things that they already do successfully in their own business. So whether that's mining companies that already have tailings that could be used for, you know, XC2 mineralization or superficial mineralization, whether it's you know, forest management companies that are already doing things that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So I think, you know, on the voluntary side, you have to have the money to do it, or it has to be a value add to your company. And so whichever way that works for them. And then on the other side, yeah, you can just tell people to do it. That's a little tougher road, though.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point, that kind of in-setting angle to this. I actually was speaking to a ag company in the US who's sort of rolling out biochar throughout their supply chains, which I thought was awesome. But yeah, good points there on that regulated demand as well. And I think brings me on to the next quite key question I think we'll be tackling here, which I'm sure will stimulate a bit of debate, is on that question on compliance. And I think, Erin, I'm going to come to you.
Don't look at me when you say a bit of debate.
So I think on that, I mean, I think a lot of people do see that the sort of mid and long-term demand is going to be stimulated through compliance markets, at least outside of North America, outside of the US potentially. And I'm particularly interested in, you know, as someone from the UK and, you know, ex-European, I actually think the ETS system, I have hope that by the time we reach sort of 2030 and beyond, we'll have some integration there. But I do think it is some time until we will have that. Before we get to the stage where compliance markets can help, what do you think governments can do to help stimulate voluntary demand till then?
I think there's a lot they can do. And we joked about debate. I think compliance markets can be great. I think it's important for us to think about, even in places where there will be compliance markets, how we get to things like legacy emissions, right? I am a skeptic that we'll get compliance markets in the US, but I think in the meantime, things like what the Department of Energy is doing right now with the procurement purchases, with a procurement prize, and the purchases they're making, you know, we love the Direct Air Capture Hubs program. We need more of that. We need more demonstration funding. I think, you know, in the US, we're going to build a lot of the carbon removal that's going to happen, and I think there are things that we can do around moving away from just what I would describe as market-based policies that are focused on driving down the cost of CDR, like our 45Q tax incentive. That's great, but we can do more than that. So looking at things like pre-permitting storage across the US, where you can have places opt in to host these projects, that you can think through those infrastructure questions as the federal government and take on some of that burden. That's going to make it easier to deploy those technologies. And it's also going to help you think through trickier questions around community engagement that are really essential for success. I also think it's really important for us. I think there's a thing that happens in the CDR space that I'm certainly guilty of, where we talk about CDR and a lot of times we mean direct air capture, or, you know, we're really making this assumption that we're talking about like high MRV TAC-based solutions. And I think there's a very good chance that we need a totally different framework for land-based carbon removal. It's not going to be, you know, 45Q style tax incentives. A lot of times it's not going to be markets or market-based policies. You know, in the US we do land policy, ag and food policy on a 5-year farm bill cycle. We are, in theory, passing a farm bill at some point in the near-term future. And we need to think now about 5 years from now, what are we going to do? We need to start thinking about very fundamentally different frameworks to scale land-based carbon removal, because that's also going to be essential, but is going to play a very different role than tech-based CDR.
Yeah, really interesting. And to Giana, to you on this point as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that Erin said as well. I think there's a real role for governments to come in and not only stimulate demand themselves, but also to stimulate voluntary purchasing in the private sector. I think one thing that we haven't really dug into yet is what the Department of Energy in the US can do as they're implementing their carbon removal purchasing prize. And I think in particular, the more that they can show their work for those purchases, to talk about what are the criteria they used, how did they require these companies to contract with monitoring, reporting, and verification providers and third-party verifiers, the more that the Department of Energy can create sort of a buyer's guide to help ease the sort of administrative and technical burden that comes with purchasing these tons, I think the more that we'll see voluntary buyers entering this space. I think cost is a really high barrier to entry for these companies, but I would say the second barrier is really being able to look at proposals and make a decision about what carbon removal tons are right for you. And so the more the Department of Energy can do there, I think the better. I think the second thing really comes down to investments in innovation. I think Erin talked a lot about demonstration, but there's more work that governments can do to really invest in monitoring, reporting, and verification, both innovation to make sure that we have better sensors to help us measure things like soil carbon, but also creating stronger standards and frameworks that allow us to better compare carbon removal solutions in an apples-to-apples way. I think that's going to be really tough in the long run, but especially for some of the more open system solutions, we need a greater level of certainty about what tons are being removed on what timescales.
Yeah, and I was just going to agree with that and add, I think that transparency, look, we're seeing things like the DAC Hubs projects move forward, and there are questions from the people who live in those places about what these, what are the questions they should ask about these projects? Like, how do they get good information? And I think that's something where it's not just on the carbon removal companies, but I think the buyers can play an important role, can be in some ways more trusted as people who are saying, wondering about some of the same questions that those communities are having, that they can be great communicators in that space to say, this is how we're doing our due diligence. Here's some transparency here. So in addition to the government, I think there are things when we're thinking about sort of the political coalitions, the long-term durability of these policies. You only get these policies if they continue to be popular with constituents. And so there's a role that buyers can play too in being a credible actor and being a trusted source. You guys are doing this due diligence already. Talk to the community about it.
Yeah, I think I agree with both of you, and I think in the context of the US, those are definitely crucial things to help stimulate demand. I'm sort of interested, there's an element of the political uncertainty in the US that makes us want to look further afield as well, and look particularly at the EU and into Asia as well. I'd maybe be interested to get, maybe Bayo, come to you on this. Outside of the US example, how do you see, before we get to the stage where we've got compliance schemes for removal credits, what do you think that governments can help do to really support companies to purchase these credits in the meantime?
Yeah, I think you can look to the example of what's starting to happen in the Nordics, where the governments are recognizing that we need removals as part of our net zero. We don't want to pay for everything with taxpayers' money, and we see that there is a VCM demand. Why don't we meet halfway? And we will support the development of projects that will ultimately get embedded under our NDCs, but those credits will still be available for VCM buyers. So I think that's a model that could be relevant in more places than you can imagine. So that's certainly one that I see. I think there is probably something around, one of the things that excited us as a company about things like direct air capture, et cetera, is that you can do them in a wide variety of geographies. And the multiplicity of technologies that you have today means that there are certain technologies that are better suited for certain places than the others. So you can certainly see action between governments and more of your DFIs to explore citing this outside of just US, EU, UK group, and alongside that, you create local jobs, you stimulate some, you get some funding from those governments, from the DFIs to support those plans. But maybe you get completely different corporates. There are large corporates outside the West interested in purchasing this because this is something that is close to home, and they would be interested in participating.
Yeah. No, I think a really interesting discussion there on the compliance issue. I think I'm excited to see there's like increased traction at home in the UK, in the US. I think that we're starting to see a real kind of turning point coming where I think some of these ideas are definitely being heard, which is exciting. Maybe just moving on quickly to the next thing I wanted to tackle was a lot of the companies, as we discussed, like the tech companies, are often the companies that need that capacity of removal the least, and they're the ones that are having the most offtakes being secured sort of in the years ahead. Those hard-to-abate sectors that we have discussed a bit that maybe are lower margin, I think there's a challenge there to how we can help get them into the demand pool. And I'd be interested, Jack, to hear from you about how you think we might be able to do that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think hard to abate is like a sort of hand-wavy term that people use a lot, and it's most, like, some are incredibly difficult, but that's just because we haven't necessarily put the money and research and development into those industries. It's just they're behind relative to things like the power sector, which there's been years of not just development, but public policy support for solar. Solar is cheap now because Germany helped by buying down the cost very early on. In the United States, there's an investment tax credit. There's sometimes state tax credits. There's renewable portfolio standards. I mean, there's a whole sort of suite of policies that have helped drive down the cost of solar. And in order to do that, for some of these companies who don't have the free cash flow to be able to purchase CDR at the moment and are yet have outsized emissions relative to them, you have to have that support on the front end to be able to make them afford it. Now, whether that's they inset it like we discussed earlier, whether that's they actually become a pseudo CDR company themselves or have a spin out, whether that's they become suppliers of things like olivine or mine tailings or whatever, you have to support them along the way. And I think that frequently the hard to abate sector is like, why aren't they doing anything? And it's like, well, they would like to. I think if you align the incentives correctly, they will do something, but there aren't the incentives right now. So you have to, and it's got to be largely through public policy, at least at the start. And so to get them to do it, again, you give them a value proposition, and I think that they'll accomplish it.
Yeah, I think there's also an element of giving them a framework where they're not going to get punished for doing action is also crucial. I mean, we've already seen some leadership from aviation companies, and there's been the same kind of reputational challenges that some of them have faced for trying hard at this. So, Bayo, did you?
Yeah, I could build on that a little bit. Like the hard-to-abate sectors tend to sit deep in the value chain, with the exception of aviation. They're deep in the value chain. They have customers that are not necessarily having the same margin issues that they have, certainly not across all of their products. So how can we create aligned incentives, think about things like product carbon factors, et cetera, that are tradable, that you can link to removals, purchases across the value chain, that can be financed by customers who have slightly higher willingness to pay than the primary producer. I think that could be one way that we unlock participation for those sectors as well.
Definitely. And just moving on, I want one more question from me before I turn to the audience. And Giana, I think I'm going to come to you on this one. Often in these discussions, we really fixate on like quite far away targets, like 2050 demand. I really often am trying to bring conversations earlier when I speak to people in the industry. How can we try and foster more demand for those nearer term solutions that are ready to deploy and we can get those removals in the next sort of 5 years? I'd be interested to get from your point of view how we can help do that.
A couple of thoughts here. I think one, it's important to make this distinction that we actually need to be deploying all carbon removal solutions today, no matter their technology readiness levels or open questions there are about the cost or the science or the ability to monitor, report, and verify the tons that come from these solutions, because the only way we learn is by building projects. I think Climeworks has done a really good job of talking about what are the lessons they've learned from Orca, what are the new sorbent technologies they're testing that they want to feed into Cyprus, and they only know those things because they've tested these technologies on the ground. And so in order to meet our 2030 goals and our longer term goals, we need to actually be deploying these solutions. And I think that means there's a really critical role for governments to play, to come in where government in relation to private sector capital is able to take on more risk. They're able to take on projects that have much longer returns. And so I think there's a role for governments across the globe. My focus is in the US, so think a lot about how can the government come in and just essentially fund demonstration or use things like the CDR purchasing prize to drive demand in the near term in a way that de-risks these solutions in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years. I think for some of the more nature-based solutions in particular, there are a lot of programs in the US that are already in place that we pay essentially land managers, whether that's farmers or foresters, to manage their lands in ways that create environmental benefits. A lot of times we think about biodiversity and conservation benefits and soil health, but I think those things could be really easily extended to the carbon removal and climate space as well. So thinking about how do we harness frameworks that we already have for shifting the way that land managers manage their land to also include things like biochar, enhanced rock weathering, soil carbon sequestration.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting one, particularly on those nature-based solutions like afforestation and sort of biochar, these ones which are kind of deploying right now and achieving those removals. Erin, I'd be interested to get your take, maybe not just looking at from a government point of view, but to get some of that demand for those nearer-term solutions, maybe from a voluntary space or sort of further afield. How do you think that can be achieved?
I mean, I do think one of the things Giana said is, earlier was around this role of government procurement, not because the government's just going to be the customer, but they're going to get that stamp of approval. And I think being able to, Giana and I were having a conversation about this at lunch, and hopefully it's fun to share, but that I think the government can and should both invest in some of those earlier stage projects that are less clear, that we might not say, okay, these should be part of the voluntary market. The government's just like, this is what the government does. And can also drive a lot of clarity on what should be part of a market, what can be, what does have like that sort of stamp of approval. Because again, going back to like who buys it now and why, part of it is not, I'd imagine, and Bayo, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not just that they have the money to pay whatever, $600, $1,000, $2,000 per ton, but they also have the money to, have a whole team to vet the MRV and go through that process. And if you make it easier for companies to do that, we've seen that with, Carbon Direct and others, then you're going to get more people in, right? And so I think the federal government doing that and saying, yes, okay, cool, this is, this is a good thing to buy is going to go a long way.
Yeah, other solutions for vetting projects do exist, just saying. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I would love to try and get a couple of questions in from the audience. Oh, we've got some. There we go. Sorry, I'm stealing your...
That's my phone. Be careful.
Okay, good. Right, okay, first one up, about risks and incentives. In a context where not all potential buyers are equipped to take informed decision on the purchase, how can they mitigate their reputation or greenwashing risk? Does anyone want to jump in? Jack?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one kind of clear way to do it would be to not buy really bad offsets in projects. And I think that that's self-evident, but it's true. I mean, you look and you just like most of the credits sold today, incredibly low prices, something in the 50 cents. And I've put this challenge out. No one has met me on it yet. I'll buy you a drink if you can find something else you can buy a ton of for 50 cents. So if anyone can bring me something that I can get a ton of for 50 cents that's real, let me know. The drink is yours. I think that you have to have an approach that is open, it's transparent. You work with other experts in the field if you don't have it yourself. I mean, credibility is the sort of name of the game. In my opinion, CDR, there's a number of really good folks who do it, and whether it is, there's the Carbon Directs and the Patch and the Watersheds of the world who do really great work, or it's deciding you want to do this seriously over a long period of time and building out that capacity within yourself, like Microsoft has done over there. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think a really good piece of advice would be, like, don't buy the really awful credits, please. Tell your friends. And then after that, it would be consult with professionals.
I think it feels also like it doesn't matter what you do in carbon removal isn't the only thing that matters. Like, is your company also lobbying against climate policies? Is your company doing everything you can to mitigate? Like, carbon removal in a lot of ways should be your last resort, right? You should stop emitting as much as you can stop emitting, and then buy really good carbon removal to address what you can't actually mitigate at the moment. And not then, I mean, I think a lot of times the greenwashing claim gets levied against people who, you know, are doing a lot of shady stuff. It's not unearned a lot of times. I'm not saying it's never been unearned, but if you're going to lobby against climate action, if you're going to buy $50 cent per ton offsets and not try to mitigate seriously, and I think if you do those things and you're transparent and open about that and say, even if you are buying stuff where you're like, hey, the uncertainty isn't 100, or the certainty isn't 100% here, but this is why we're doing it, I think, maybe I'm giving people too much credit, but I think that you aren't going to get the same sort of greenwashing claims.
Yeah, and
the only one I'll add is buyer clubs, join a club. Yeah. There's buyer clubs who are building up the capability that can be shared across multiple people. So,
yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point, this, on the high-risk credits. I mean, we've rated 450-odd credits now, and the vast majority are in basically high or somewhat high-risk categories. There are very few that get into sort of A or above in the top 3 categories. I think it's something like 20 credits that have got in there. So definitely resonate with that. And, you know, our ratings are public, so you can be sure to get low-risk credits online. So we've got time for one more question, which I've still got in the bank, which we've covered a little bit, is about the next big wave of purchases. Is it really going to come from companies, or really is it going to come from governments procuring carbon removal? Big question. Not sure we're in the driving seat to know that, but I'd be really interested, maybe starting with you, Erin, about your instincts on that.
Companies. I mean, the government's going to buy. I have to shout out my colleague John Milko, who's got a procurement report coming out next week. We're ambitious about that, but there's, you know, we saw a $30 to $40 billion market, and I think we're going to see more companies buy.
Companies?
I agree.
Yeah, same.
Cool.
I think to put the DOE's purchase price in perspective, they're funding this at $35 million per year, so that's a relatively small amount compared to what we need for the total market for carbon removal in 2030, and so we need, you know, private sector purchasers to come in, and we need to think about how can the DOE leverage that $35 million to unlock a much bigger sum of money. And
maybe sorry, Bayo, do you want to go?
I was going to say, companies are going to buy, but they need to be able to tell a good story. I think the people who have gone first, and so you can't tell that story anymore. But like, this is where the accounting frameworks need to accommodate the fact that high-end, high-quality removals purchases don't create any moral hazard on a net zero journey, and maybe consider a little bit more flexibility around that.
And outside of the US, which governments are you hopeful about doing public procurement? I'm kind of interested. Quick fire, maybe.
I'm excited about the EU doing more regulatory policy more than procurement, because we're bad at that in the US, and you guys are really good, and I think you should lead the way on that.
Run out of money, though. That's the issue.
That's not going to help with procurement either.
I'm bullish on Canada. I mean, they have the DOE purchasing prize is amazing. The procurement program in Canada is a true procurement program in the word of like what procurement means in policy and how you actually buy something from the federal government. That is a true procurement program in Canada. It's first of a kind, and they have an incredible Carbon Removals Canada, Naeem, and the team up there is just doing amazing work on the policy side to literally go from 0 to 1 in less than a year of that organization being around to advocate for stuff like that. So it's amazing, and Canada has great natural resources. So, yeah.
Very exciting. Well, I'm getting a flashing light, so I think we've got to wrap it up. But thank you so much, my panelists, and thank you for the questions that you sent through.